Balance in the Force is one of the most misunderstood phrases in Star Wars. Later Jedi redefined it as destroying the Sith. Many today imagine a so-called Grey Jedi as one who walks between the extremes. But in the earliest days of the galaxy, when the Force was still being discovered, balance meant something much more direct. It meant survival. The Jedi Order of Tython lived by balance as a necessity. The Force was not yet divided into light and dark creeds. It was Ashla and Bogan, serenity and passion, order and chaos, restraint and release. Both were essential. Too much of either led to ruin. And among the very early Jedi, or the Jedi, one warrior became the living embodiment of that truth. That warrior's name was Hawk Ryo. Hawk did not come to balance through abstract philosophy though. He came by it honestly, shaped by the storms of Tython, the jaws of its predators, and the hardships of a wider galaxy. Nature itself taught him to be merciful and when to be ruthless. Later as a ranger and as a soldier in the Despot War, these lessons made him one of the most feared and respected fighters of the entire age. So today, my friends and fellow lore junkies, we will be looking at maybe the absolute best example of a Grey Jedi or a balanced Force wielder that has ever existed in the lore. One of the earliest Force wielders, in fact. The Jedi Code of Balance. Tython was no ordinary world. It was a planet that was alive in the Force, so sensitive that when Ashla and Bogan fell out of harmony, the planet itself convulsed. These convulsions manifested as colossal storms, cyclones of raw energy that could destabilize settlements, tear apart starships, or scour entire landscapes clean. The Jedi Order saw this as proof that imbalance was deadly. Their code was not a moral abstraction, but survival doctrine. They trained in both Ashla and Bogan. Those who strayed too far to either side were exiled to the moons that bore their names, until they again reached balance. On Tython, imbalance could kill you. Hawk Ryo was the one who most fully absorbed that lesson. He was the most perfect Jedi Ranger that we could find. Hawk's childhood was a crucible. To grow up on Tython was to face predators, storms, and the raw chaos of the Force. Rancor kin prowled the plains, brutal precursors to the Rancors of the later ages. Hawk learned that hesitation against such beasts meant death. Then you had the Flesh Raiders, degenerate Rakatan descendants twisted by the dark side. They forced Hawk to master patience and strategy, since they hunted in cunning packs. Winged Uvak kin swept down from the skies with claws like blades, teaching Hawk vigilance. Each beast was a lesson. From the Rancor, he learned ruthlessness. From the Flesh Raiders, discipline. From the Uvaks, constant watchfulness. But then you had the storms. Even deadlier were Tython's 4 storms. They erupted when Ashla and Bogan fell out of harmony. Titanic tempests of fire, lightning, and raw energy. To panic was to die. Hawk learned to read the storms, to know when to seek shelter, when to endure, when to move. The storms taught him serenity not as a theory, but as a necessity. Predators demanded ferocity, storms demanded calm. Together they forged Hawk into something unique. A man who lived in balance not as a philosophy, but as a practice. Hawk Ryo the Ranger. This group were the scouts, the diplomats, and the guardians who carried the Jedi way beyond Tython into the wider galaxy. Rangers made judgment calls alone, without councils to guide them. Hawk excelled here. He survived deserts, frozen wastelands, and lawless star systems. He negotiated peace when possible, but when violence was inevitable, he struck decisively and without hesitation. He became known as the Ranger who could survive anywhere. Mercy when it was earned, ruthlessness when it was demanded. In Hawk Ryo, the Jedi ideal of balance became flesh. And then came the Despot War. Hawk's legend reached its height during the Despot War, when Queen Hadia raised armies to conquer Tython and its neighboring systems. It was one of the first galactic wars involving the Force. Many Jedi faltered. Some were consumed by vengeance, others paralyzed by serenity. But Hawk thrived. His ranger training had taught him to live without constant guidance. In battle, he unleashed ferocity without hatred. In defense, he endured without passivity. Contemporaries considered him perhaps the finest warrior of the entire age, not because he was the strongest, but because he was whole. Hawk Ryo embodied the balance. But how did the greatest warrior of this era fight? To call Hawk Ryo merely a survivor would undersell him a great deal. He was, by the judgment of his peers, the greatest fighter of the entire era. Unlike many who leaned too far into serenity and hesitation in combat, or those who gave into rage and were exiled, Hawk found harmony between the two of them, and this made him nearly unstoppable. At the time, Force wielders used unstable Force sabers, dangerous weapons that resonated with the dark side and demanded perfect discipline. Most wielders either overextended or collapsed under the strain and pressure. Hawk, however, thrived here. His foundation was rooted in the broad, adaptable strokes of what would later become Form 1 Shi-Cho. This gave Hawk a versatile base from which he could adapt to any enemy. But Hawk's mastery went beyond simple technique. He carried into combat the patience of a negotiator and the ferocity of a predator. In him, serenity and instinct were not opposites, but allies. He could defend with calm endurance, echoing what would later become known as Form 3 Surisu, and in the same moment turn that defense into an overwhelming counter, striking with the decisive ferocity that would centuries later define Form 5 Gem-So. If measured against later Jedi, Hawk fought with compassion and restraint, the likes of which we see in Obi-Wan Kenobi, and the ferocity and the conviction of Anakin Skywalker, as well as the raw survival instinct of Mace Windu. But he was not bound to councils, codes, or forms. Hawk Ryo fought like a Ronin in the Force, a masterless warrior who answered only to balance. This blend of compassion and decisiveness set him apart. Many Jedi of this era could endure or could strike, but very few could judge when to do one or the other. But Hawk Ryo always knew. That judgment, forged in the Predators and the Storms of Tython, made him perhaps the most complete fighter of an entire generation. What made him truly dangerous, though, was not his skill with the blade alone, but the harmony that he embodied when he fought. He could show compassion to an enemy who deserved mercy, or cut them down with absolute conviction when diplomacy failed. That judgment to know when to stay your hand and when to strike, that is what made him feared by his enemies and revered by his allies. Unlike later Jedi who would bind themselves to codes, or the Sith who enslaved themselves to passion, Hawk Ryo was truly free. He lived as a wanderer when not in wartime, a Ronin, whose allegiance was not to an order or an emperor, but to the living balance that Tython had taught him. This is why he's one of the best examples of a balanced Force wielder. The Force flowed through him in its most primordial form. He was not Jedi, not Sith, not even bound to any council. He was bound to balance. A balance that he carried on the edge of his blade. Other Force traditions in the later centuries would misread this lesson. The Gen Sarai, which arose among the Jedi, claimed that the Jedi were the true villains and sought their destruction, mistaking balance for rebellion. Millennia later, the Imperial Knights of the Legacy era tied their balance to the loyalty of their Emperor, mistaking harmony for obedience. But Hawk belonged to none of these Grey Jedi. He was not bound to a council, nor to Jedi orthodoxy, nor to an Emperor. He was pure. His path was shaped by the storms, the predators, and the lessons of his home. In that sense, Hawk Ryo stands as one of the earliest and the purest examples of a gray or a balanced Force wielder in all Star Wars lore. Unlike many warriors of legend, Hawk Ryo endured. After the Despot War, he returned to a simple life as a ranger, traveling, meditating, surviving. He was not killed and did not fall to corruption. He simply continued to live in balance. To younger generations, Hawk was more than a war hero. He was proof that balance could be lived every day, day by day, not just in moments of crisis. His greatest triumph was not a single battle, but was rather a lifetime lived in harmony with the Force's most primordial state. Before the corruption of the Jedi or the Sith, there was Hawk Ryo, a true man who sought true balance. He was a warrior of predators and storms, a ranger who survived anywhere, a fighter who could unleash fury without being consumed, and above all else, he was a warrior and a man who let the Force of Tython itself guide him. Hawk Ryo was one of the first true agents of balance in Star Wars lore. With Hawk Ryo today, guys, I wanted to highlight a really good example of a balanced Force wielder. Of course, there's a ton of debate on what exactly it means to be a Grey Jedi in the lore, and I think Hawk Ryo is a really great example of one. But what are your thoughts on this, my friends? And do you want to see more lore documented here on the channel about the dawn of the Jedi? But as always, my friends and fellow Star Wars lore junkies, may the Force be with you, and I hope you're having a great day.